Hello, everyone. Welcome to this special presentation of the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival. I'm Alicia Malone from Turner Classic Movies, and I've been lucky for the last couple of years to get to speak at the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival and do some moderating in person and introduce some films. And I'm so happy to be back, especially for this virtual Q&A for Fiddler's Journey to the Big Screen. And I'm your moderator for today's Q&A, and I'm joined by the director and the co-writer and researcher, so I'll introduce them both. Daniel Raim is the director. He is also the producer and co-writer, a documentarian who strives to preserve cinema history and depict the art, craft, and soul of the movies through intimate portraits of cinema artists. And that is something he's certainly done with his previous films, including the Oscar-nominated short documentary, The Man on Lincoln's Nose, Harold and Lillian, A Hollywood Love Story, which is such a beautiful, beautiful movie, and the documentary that he made for Turner Classic Movies, Image Makers, The Adventures of America's Pioneer Cinematographers. Hi, Daniel. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. It's great to see you.
And we also have Michael Srago, who is Daniel's co-writer and researcher for the film. And he was also the producer and writer for Image Makers. He's also got a long history as a film critic and correspondent and columnist. You may have read his work in The New Yorker, where he worked with Pauline Kael. He was the first film critic for The Rolling Stone. He's authored books, including the Marfield Prize-winning Victor Fleming, An American Movie Maker. He's also programmed for the Criterion channel, and he's also the contributing editor for Film Comment. Michael, I hope I got all your credits right. You do so much.
Thanks for your generosity. Thank you. Good to be here.
So nice to see you both, and I really enjoyed this film. So, Daniel, I just want to start with a pretty obvious question, which is, why Fiddler on the Roof? What has that movie meant to you throughout your life?
Thank you. Oh man. So Fiddler on the Roof has been a film that has been dear to my heart long before I was a cinephile, like at a young age. My grandparents had this double VHS cassette, Fiddler on the Roof, that they ran for me in their living room on a little 4:3 TV. I'm sure it was like pan and scanned at that time. And but boy, did I soak it all in, especially sitting, with them in the living room. And they themselves and their families survived the Holocaust. So kind of that whole experience of sort of absorbing that film, and of course the music. And then in 2009, when I saw my wife was like, wow, Chaim Topol is having a farewell tour at the Pantages in Los Angeles. And I was really glad that I saw it. It was one of his last shows ever. And I was amazed just standing there, again, soaking in the music and the story. But this time, I felt like I was surrounded by people of all different ethnicities that were, and the universality of it and the specificity of it sort of all kind of hit me like, wow, this is so literally a year later, in 2009, I interviewed, my first interview for this doc was Chaim Topol at his home in Tel Aviv.
Yeah, I mean, it's a film that I remember seeing when I was a kid, but not one that I really appreciated until years later. So Michael, for you, I'm interested to know what your history has been with the film and also whether it's changed throughout your career as a film critic.
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I grew up, I'm old enough to have seen the play. So, that was a big deal at the time. Since we're at the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival, it's worth noting that having so much Jewish content on Broadway explicitly was a breakthrough. And so everybody who was putting together the play thought, this will never last, because once the different synagogue groups and Hadassahs, by their time, no one will be left to see it. And instead it became this, a global hit. And part of it, of course, is that it was just such a seamless piece of stagecraft and writing that Joe Stein, who I wish we had a chance to talk to, because he also did the screenplay for the movie, but he's no longer with us. He did a tremendous job of adapting three of the original stories about Tevye, the milkman, and his daughters from the Sholem Aleichem run of stories that people think of as a novel, even though he wrote them over decades, And so it was this powerful story about a family, about generational conflict within the family, about social and political conflict outside the family, anti-Semitism, of course. All my ancestors came from the Pale of Settlement, where all the Jews were put in Eastern Europe. I remember my parents begging my grandmother to see the play. And when she did, she hated it. She hated it. She said, I lived through it. Why do I have to see this? But when the wedding came with the little mini pogrom they include there, she just wanted to leave the theater. So it was a very powerful event. It was not my favorite musical growing up, but when I saw the film, is actually when I fell in love with Fiddler on the Roof. There was something about what Jewison did, which is what Dan captures, I think, so remarkably in this documentary, if I could praise something that I've also worked on, but still. He manages to be both epic in this reconstruction of this lost way of life and very intimate. His use of close-ups, the devices he uses to bring us inside Tevye's head as he's speaking to God or as he's weighing the thoughts in his head. Just when I watched that, I felt involved with it on a level that I had never felt involved with it on the stage. And I remember seeing it in 1971, and I was loving it. I was with it, but by the time we got to the scene where he's singing about his daughter Chava, it was overpowering. Even now I'm sort of welling up thinking about it. So to me, the musical was a great event. To me, the movie is a really great work of art. And I felt that way from the time I saw it. And working on this film has been such a blessing, really, because I got to revisit that, every day with Dan. So.
Yeah, you mentioned Norman Jewison. I mean, one thing that I love about this documentary is that as much as it's about the film's journey to a big screen, it's really also about Norman Jewison's journey himself. So, Daniel, can you tell us about wanting to frame the movie in that way?
It's a great question. I think the turning point, I've always been, as you mentioned in the introduction, most of all my documentaries actually are about the creative process, but specifically kind of the inner life of an artist and what that entails from an inner journey, as well as its impact and its inner journey, not just as on the film set, but what are life experiences that inform our lives and then inform the decisions we make as storytellers. And Norman has been a director is a director who's been dear to my heart. I first got to interview him in 2000 for The Man on Lincoln's Nose, which was a documentary about my professor, Robert Boyle, who had worked with Jewison on several important big classic Jewison films, starting with I'm gonna skip one, but I'm going the big ones include The Russians Are Coming, The Thomas Crown Affair, and then Fiddler, and then Gaily, and then Fiddler on the Roof. And he had also designed films for Alfred Hitchcock, which is why Norman brought him into his world in the first place. And so I was curious to learn more about what makes Norman such a great visual storyteller, such a great director. And when I read his autobiography, just about in 2016, he tells two stories that just opened it up for me to answer your question. One is, now that you've seen the film, he says literally in the first sentence of his autobiography is from the time that I was 6 years old, I've always wanted to be a Jew. And I'm like, wait, what? And what did that journey involve? I got to speak with Norman because he writes about it, but I wanted to hear it from his own, from his own word, in his own words. And also the kind of a culminating event leading up to just before Fiddler started principal photography. I think they're already in pre-production at that point, but his very close friend Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. And that was, as he writes about it and talks about it in this documentary, a spiritual crisis. And then he says, I found myself making Fiddler on the Roof. So I said to Mike, okay, can we make a story around this? Is there, I mean, I have this amazing this interview I shot with Norman, 2-hour deep dive into Fiddler on the Roof and his life around that. And can we whittle it down? Can we really kind of get into the core of it? And fortunately, the National Film Board of Canada sent a crew to Lekenek, Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, and to the Pinewood Studios in London, where they shot the film. And we had the ability to scan those master 16 millimeter, those masters, and include some of that footage that was that the National Film Board made the 60-minute kind of profile of verite profile of Jewison, but we were able to use that to really illustrate what our interview subjects really helped us. So like we got through John Williams, through interviewing John Williams and through interviewing Robert Boyle and through interviewing the three daughters, we kind of get a rounded portrait of what it's like to work with Norman Jewison and why he was kind of at his A game, really on his A game, making Fiddler on the Roof.
Yeah, it's a delight to see him in Yugoslavia on the set, and he seems like he was having a great time, even though, as always with making movies, a lot of things were going wrong at the time, or things had to be figured out. But Michael, for you, when it comes to co-writing this documentary, how do you begin to scale down that story and make it into a narrative?
Well, actually, we got to the point where we weren't sure we were just going to do the movie we ended up doing. Dan had actually recorded some other interviews with critics, literary critic, a noted literary critic of the Latham, and we had thought that maybe there's a bigger movie to be done, but other things have been done about Fiddler. So when we looked at it and I just thought, well, I've already said that my love is really for the movie. I thought, well, I think you can have something special if we really just home in on the movie. And Dan had done such remarkable work with Topol as well as Norman Jewison. Yeah. And we found as we were going on that it was almost the central points jumped out. The idea of Norman's not just his political and social journey with Bobby Kennedy and his feeling for that era, but also his power as a filmmaker, his mastering this epic expanse, and this ability he found that we see in the footage of him being able to kind of throw his spirit to the other people. I mean, this just jumped out of the footage, and it jumps out at you in Dan's interview footage with him. He is a kind of theatrical filmmaker who's innately theatrical, so it doesn't seem forced. He's a storyteller who gives himself over to the story he tells, whether in person or in his movies. So that became a central thing. How do we, Norman is great at setting his goals and announcing that he wanted this to be a great picture, and his love pours through. How do we really help get the other people to articulate that? Mm-hmm. Because Norman is as great as he is at storytelling. He doesn't always, as no storyteller actually should. He doesn't really kind of expand philosophically or in some kind of analytic aesthetics, about what he does. But through talking with John, who was fabulous, talking about how important it is for a director to have that musicality, and talking with Boyle about how you make the production physically understandable, we found that as we charted the making of the movie, all the spiritual stuff and all the content stuff was coming out because it was so embedded in the goal of the movie that Norman was just radiating, even if he wasn't articulating it. So to me, some of the most moving things I've never seen John Williams quite so spontaneous as when he starts to try to describe Jewish music. And he says, I think Jewish music has a tear and a tear. And I was just knocked out when I was watching this interview, because I just thought, not only is he's doing two kinds of tear, he's doing a tear and a tear. Or when Boyle, which I didn't know until, I saw Dan's wonderful footage when he talks about his wife being a child of the Yiddish theater, and his kind of bone deep affinity to that. I mean, the photos Dan uses are so gorgeous, but that whole idea of this group, this very diverse group of people, this Methodist Canadian director, this Irish American production designer, John Williams. I actually don't know what his religious name, coming together and making like the greatest Jewish movie ever made. To me, it was like inspiring. And Oswald Morris, yes, our wonderful, the great British cinematographer. So that I think Dan and I agree that we didn't set out to do this, but that became, as we were telling the story, just a fun and also an inspiring thing.
There's so much love, Norman and Topol, and then for Shalom Aleichem, the Yiddish author who wrote the Tevye stories over 20 years that Joe Stein and Jerry Buck and Sheldon Harnick kind of devised into the stage play. I wanted to start there, I wanted to kind of deep dive in there, but it was about Norman Jewison. So all these narrative elements that were so rich and meaningful and had been done since I started in 2009 filming this. A doc came out about Shalom Aleichem. I think it's called Laughing in the Dark.
Great movie too.
A great film, absolutely. And then another documentary came out about Fiddler 2 or 3 years ago, Fiddler, A Miracle of Miracles, that focused specifically on the I think Jerome Robbins, right, and the development of the stage play and then its cultural impact. So as I think that there's a kind of a unification of doing an X-ray of Fiddler on the Roof from the point of view of the cinema artists, right? Yeah. And it's a unique approach. And I think those three films kind of are sort of cousins in a way, and they can be appreciated together. And I think there's a lot more to tell about Fiddler on the Roof too.
Yeah, and these interviews you captured are so wonderful to preserve this kind of history. But obviously in 2009, Dan, you didn't know exactly what the documentary was going to be. So how much of a challenge was it to work in the existing interviews?
Well, that's the beauty of it, that once we gave ourselves the freedom to say, okay, let's just make this about as much as we can about Norman. But then when we interviewed the three daughters, that's their story supported Norman's story. It's about identity and about finding yourself through the film and how they found themselves and where they found themselves after the film.
Thinking about how long ago you started recording these interviews, and obviously you didn't know what the end documentary was going to be like, but were you capturing them just thinking, I want to capture this story now, and then was that a challenge to fit it in later on?
Yeah. Well, the original working title back then was The Storyteller, and the unifying idea was from Shalom Aleichem all the way through the filmmaker, the cinema. They're all great storytellers rooted in different experiences and interpreting this original material. But then once we decided to really just focus on the film and Norman's journey through it, and then its impact on him and the others, even you get a sense of John Williams' sort of great love for that period and that collaboration. And what I learned from John Williams and Robert Boyle is that it is really about the people you're working with too. It's the material, you put your soul into it, but so I think there's a kind of amazing harmony between Boyle and Williams and Morris and all these collaborators that Norman brought in. So to answer your question, I think that the interview with Norman was mainly kind of the arc of the documentary. I think Mike would agree is sort of the chronological journey, in making it from pre-production, this long location scout that was already documented in The Man on Lincoln's Nose with Boyle and Jewison. So I was already very curious to dramatize that and depict it even further. But I think we learned so much, though, just right in the middle of the pandemic in May of last year of 2021, we had this window before Delta. Then we interviewed John Williams and traveled and interviewed the three daughters remotely as well, and had a crew in New York set up a camera. It was quite an adventure. And I think I learned a lot about the journey of making a big caliber Hollywood musical.
Yeah, we actually had, before we knew we might not be able to shoot new interviews until very late in the game. So we actually had a rough script, a rough assembly with materials that we had, gathered from far and wide, to plug in, knowing we'd want to do our original stuff. So by the time May came around and we had the chance to do these interviews, we sort of had, we got more than we expected from everybody, but we sort of had the idea, of where we could fit it, and rough idea of where the journey would go. We had found, the part of the material in the movie is from the Directors Guild interview with Norman Jewison, and we had already known from his autobiography that he had this very intense Southern trip after his time in service in Canada, when he always wanted to go to New Orleans, and he had this terrible experience, not realizing that in the South, in the Jim Crow South, a white guy wasn't supposed to sit in the back with African Americans. Yeah. And so to see, we found him, actually saying that, in this Directors Guild interview. And by that time, the spirit of our film, and in terms of how we thought about Jewison's Fiddler, was sort of emerging as partly of this great kind of humanistic outreach, really, which I think is at the center of Norman's best work. And so we did do this one detour. It was one of the hardest things we worked on, was where to put it in. We wanted to get in that, he had not make it the linchpin of his creativity or anything, as I think some other documentaries might, but just to get that story in, to get in some testimony to just the kind of person he is, the kind of person who would respond to that kind of injustice, and also admit in a very human way that he didn't know what to do because he was, such a kid. So so there were little detours we took. That was the biggest one, I think, in terms of chronology, where to put that in. One of the greatest discoveries I had as a researcher was finding the one of the two musical specials he did with Harry Belafonte. And I think, it would be a great goal for somebody. Tonight with Belafonte is one of the great TV specials, one of the great musical experiences I've had. It's not just Belafonte, who's amazing, but Odetta is in it as well, who is this, I don't know if people know her now, but she was out of an African-American folk tradition, and just a sound that could fill cathedrals, that could still fill city squares, all done with artists, the best African-American artists of that period. We get to clip a little bit of that, but that was an amazing discovery.
And this was Norman Jewison's first live musical TV special, right, Mike?
Well, he'd done other live things because he was working for your Hit Parade, actually.
Right, Hit Parade, right.
which was one of the other fun things you do that don't fit into the movie. John Williams' father also worked on the Hit Parade. Right. But, which I hope relaxed John with us when he learned that we knew that. But, Belafonte was, Norman had already had a big reputation as a musical director on television, which was one of the things I think we wanted to put right up in the film, because a lot of people at the time who didn't follow that thought, why are they picking him to do Fiddler on the Roof? He was an ace TV musical director. But Tonight with Belafonte was so special. It was the first, American TV special with an African-American talent at the center, and a guy who was just a media superstar at the time. There's actually another musical special with Belafonte he did that I'm dying to see. So I hope TCM or somebody makes it, challenge of seeing it. It was something called New York 19. He did it like a few months after he did this first one. And New York 19 was the postal district for the most diverse district in New York. And so the special was celebrating this kind of multiplicity of ethnicities and races and voices. I would die to see that. And it got great reviews for Norman and for Harry. So there was all this stuff bubbling around. It was just fun, actually. And looking back on it, there was pressure, but it was a lot of fun to deal with just these great materials.
And also, Mike, in the script, made this beautiful connection between the Russian submarine captain and the Russians coming to Tevye, the warmth and the humor, and it really is, I think, an extension of Norman himself, right? These actors kind of get in a bit to Norman's shoes, and he actually plays the characters, whether it's a 16-year-old girl, as Neva Small tells us in the film, or a Russian submarine captain, or a Jewish dairyman. I think Norman can really bring, like, as a former actor as well, embody these characters and inspire the performance through in the rehearsal process.
Yeah, he always has this twinkle in his eye. I got to meet him just before the pandemic, and he's in his 90s, but as John Williams says in this documentary, he's still young. He's younger than all of us. But Daniel, was there a sense for you of wanting to capture his story, like right now while he's still with us?
100%. 100%. The few times I had met him, I immediately experienced that sense of just warmth and generosity of spirit, and always encouraging, always so encouraging, and loved how he talked about film. And he was a kind of a spiritual mentor for me because of his desire to humanize, to make stories about people and where they live and how they live, and whether it's Moonstruck or Fiddler on the Roof, or even domestic scenes in Russians Are Coming. Like he is about family. He tells stories about issues and themes that are meaningful to me, and I wanted to find a way through this documentary to really preserve that sparkle that you just mentioned.
One thing I think us three have in common is just a desire to preserve cinema history, with me with TCM, Daniel with your movies, and Michael, I just love hearing you talk about movies because you're so enthusiastic and you highlight movies that people want to watch and you make it very accessible. So Michael, for you, how important is it to kind of preserve this kind of cinema history and the legacy of someone like Norman Jewison?
Yeah, well, I agree with everything Dan said, and we got a wonderful response from a writer director who I know, who just said, who is a slightly younger generation than Norman's generation, and he said, "Oh my God, these are the guys I wanted to be. These are the guys I wanted to emulate." They were, I think his words were, they were bracingly intelligent and they were humanistic in their intent. And this is a guy who's written some very commercial movies. And it was so great to hear that, because I feel sometimes one of the things that Dan and I tried to do in Image Makers in this movie is kind of show the emotional impact of the craft, to show why the craft matters. And it was so exciting to have moments like, John Williams say, a director has to be musical. He has to know when to pull the camera back, and to have instances we could cut to in Fiddler on the Roof or in the Judy Garland show. We know exactly where what he's talking about. I mean, I know we have film schools, but I worry that, even in academics, there's, trends and, that kind of classical storytelling, the classical expression, the idea that, yes, you're an artist, but you're a theatrical artist, addressing an audience. I fear sometimes that gets lost these days. So the idea of doing a movie about a director who is in command of all those tools and is being innovative in his own way within a tradition was something I hope would be useful for aspiring filmmakers. It's just for people who want to have a renewed appreciation of cinema that may seem to them old-fashioned or or archaic even. It's not. I mean, I think when you see Fiddler with an audience, and I hope, I can't wait to see Fiddler's Journey with an audience, but when you see Fiddler on the Roof with an audience, it has that impact, and not just with the sing-along. I look around me because I whenever I do see it, and I want to see if people are welling up at the Chava Ballet the way I did, in 1971, and they are, and that's because of the artistry that Norman Jewison with which he brought that off. Yeah. Not
to mention the performances he elicited from the three actresses. Yeah. Let's just take all of them, but let's just talk about them, because when we finished the film and some time had passed and I watched it again, I was just sort of in awe of their sort of how we kind of that casting process with Lynn Stallmaster, and none of them had acted for the screen before. I don't think they were all stage actors, and
Yeah, some had done TV.
And they're so natural, the performances in Fiddler, all three actresses and the daughters and what they bring to it. And it's just really, I think, part of what makes the movie version of Fiddler on the Roof so powerful.
Yeah, there's one thing, and Dan and I haven't talked about this much. I think I mentioned it to him, but we had a little smaller screening with the three actresses, a sort of a virtual screening, and all of us, Dan and the producer Sasha and I. And what struck me when I saw it, when we're talking about the form of the whole film, is one of the daring things about Fiddler as a musical or movie musical is it starts out very sprightly. There's a lot of funny stuff. There's serious stuff, but it's very kind of sardonic, and then it gets very, very intense in the second act or after the intermission. And that's really the test of a great production, is whether it carries you there. Whether it's that you actually feel that all the emotions are building into that really serious intensity. And I'm not comparing our work to Joe Stein's, but I felt when I watched the movie, in some way, just because of all the back and forth we had, trying to be true to the material, that our documentary kind of works that way too. And that by the time, we have Topol in this interview a piece of the interview that just really, knocked me out, talking about showing his father pictures of his father's, destroyed hometown, and the father just sweeping them away out of, really this anger, this bitterness at this, all of the family that's been destroyed. I thought, wow, this is the right place for it in our movie. And it makes me feel that we're doing something that does really reflect the artistry of Fiddler, because, we're getting into that. And so there's humor always with Norman's, patter and his talk about him wanting to be a Jew again, but there's something rooted and real. And that's part of his vision too. That's why he says, he hopes, people in Japan will understand some of the reasons that Israel came into existence. He's talking about kind of the Topol experience too. And so it all kind of fits together. And I'm just so glad it kind of worked out that way, because that was not something we actually ever consciously discussed. But I think the film, I hope, has that effect, because it has that effect on me.
It does. And one of the touching moments that I found during your documentary was Norman saying he found himself while making Fiddler on the Roof. So Daniel, to wrap up, I mean, not to draw too much of a long bow here, but what was your personal journey like in making this documentary? Did you find yourself in some particular way?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure I can answer that at this early stage.
Yeah.
In that, making this film during the pandemic, I feel like we, the filmmakers making this film, were robbed of one of the really great milestones and pleasures. And it's a painful milestone when you run the rough cut for an audience in a theater, and you get to feel your movie through the minds and eyes of an audience that you've invited. That's the real moment where you start to find yourself. I think like who, through how the audience is responding. And so I'm looking forward, to that experience and finding myself.
Yes.
But I don't know that I can really pinpoint. I think it's such a great question, because I think I do make films to find out who I am. I think that there's a lot. I mean, just in terms of Norman Jewison and sort of capturing his journey and how he found himself. I hope that this film does help audiences sort of better appreciate not just Norman, but all the kind of blood, sweat, and tears that the behind the scenes artists put into the Fiddler on the Roof. And that's part of what I hope will be its continuing legacy, because it already has such a great legacy. But maybe Fiddler's journey to the big screen can pivot the camera off of Fiddler on the Roof and onto a portrait of this group of family, of a film family, and I think that I'm really pleased with and thrilled that we were able to interview everyone and make this film.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Well, we appreciate all your blood, sweat, and tears in putting this together. Daniel Raim and Michael Strago, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Great speaking with you.
And thank you all for watching this special presentation for the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival. I'm Alicia Malone from Turner Classic Movies, and I hope to see you in person next year. Bye.
Bye.